delving into stocks, property, bonds, economics, and more. This is the Stock Market Mentor podcast. Taking an unconventional stance, we challenge the industry to help you protect your investments and empower you with the knowledge to become a savvy investor. We don't provide financial advice. Here's Steve Moriarty, Tom Hill, and Jacob Sr.
Hey, welcome back to the Stock Market Mentor podcast. We're back, the three amigos with Tom Hill and Steve Moriarty. This time around, we're going to be talking about the new normal, more specifically children, COVID, conflict, and climate. Today's episode, we'll be talking about deglobalization, reglobalization, and going from global to local. So on that note, I might pass over to Mr. Moriarty.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good to be back. Just to give the listeners a brief overview of what we're trying to do here, the period that we're in at the moment is in a sort of state of what I call a state of flux. So we've had this paradigm for the last 30 or 40 years, probably from the late 70s, mainly in the early 80s with the, the election of Margaret Thatcher in England and Ronald Reagan in the United States. And so they brought in all these new reforms because they had to deal with the post-war economy from 1945, which had run for 30 to 35 years, but then hit, as all sort of economic theories do, it started to stagnate, right? And so what they did was said, we'll just apply more of the same. And that didn't work. And eventually you get to the point where you go, we need to try something different here. And that's when Thatcher and Reagan came in and said, righto, there's less government, there's more liberalisation, we need to focus on finance more. And all of these reforms that brought in a new economy, and this is the big picture, that's now run for about 40 years. And so what we're saying now is that's reached its natural sort of problems, which is, well, interest rates were so low, they didn't, you couldn't cut them any further. Wage rates are so low, they couldn't go any lower. There's so much debt, there's nobody left to borrow. And so we're at that same pivot point where we were 40 years ago of saying, well, we need some new answers rather than just relying on the old one. Mm-hmm. And the thing we're getting out of that, well, the big impact we're going to talk about is the deglobalization from globalization in the current paradigm, and also what we talked about was the 4 Cs: COVID, conflict, children, and climate change, because they're going to be the major drivers globally of introducing a new system. And even if I just sort of say, you think about climate change and the revolution that's coming to production and consumption, right? That alone, that's not, and our argument is that's not resolvable by saying, oh, well, we'll just let the market price goods, and hey, if you haven't got any money, well, bad luck, you don't get to participate in the economy. That's no longer viable.
So the underlying message here then, the last 40 years, the way we've made our, investment decisions, it's been an unbelievable period for capital growth, which I'm sure your generation has benefited from quite nicely, Steve. Must be very nice.
Must be nice.
Must be very nice.
Hey, sometimes you just get born lucky, okay?
So what you're kind of saying here is, look, these are the major drivers why we think the way we make our investment decisions are going to have to be different over the next 30, 40 years. And we can't just rely on that, that last solid period to inform future decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And that's the main point we're going to sort of flesh out. But it's really important because generally what we do is when we look at data, the argument always is, well, is 10 years, 20 years or 100 years, which data is relevant to use now? And if we said, oh, well, let's use the last 20 years since 2000, that what we're saying is that's the old normal, right? And you can't now apply that. So in a sense, it'd be a little bit like saying, you just buy the dip, right? And because every time you've bought the dip, it's come back up.
Yeah.
And so what we're sort of saying now is be aware that buying the dip may no longer work because you're working in a different world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go back a couple of steps and throw a curvy question in there. You mentioned Maggie Thatcher from way back, which to me, and growing up in the north of England's a bit of a dirty word, Margaret Thatcher, because I think all of my family lost their jobs in the coal mine.
I was going to say, yeah, there you go.
So, but I just wanted to, now I've actually had more than an emotional response of thinking about it. Why did Maggie Thatcher decide to do that? Outsourcing, lower costs?
There was a couple of reasons. One was, yes, the ideological reason Thatcher did that because as a conservative, she wanted to basically smash the unions. Now, and this is the difference. In the 70s, unions and 60s, the unions had great power, right? Because they would collectively bargain wage rises. And so capital, the business owner, was basically always struggled because if inflation was at 5%, which at 5 and 6%, which was quite normal, right? The business owners were like, well, I had to keep putting up the prices, and that was, that reduces profit. So if you think about if you make a cup of coffee, there's an embedded cost of labour in that coffee. And then there's the cost of the materials, blah, blah, blah. And what's left over is yours as the business owner, right? Well, if the labour costs keep rising and you're unable to keep putting up the prices, then your profit margin is being squeezed, right? Now, these days you can say, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of Jacob on $32 an hour and I'm going to employ Tom on $18 an hour. All they got to do is make coffee, right? So that gap is then your profit margin. But if I come along and say, whoa, no way, dude, you can't sack Jacob because he's part of the union. And, if you sack Jacob, we're all going on strike and you're all going to start losing money. Your natural response is, or the owner's response is, Jesus, I'd love to give these unions a bullet. And that's what Thatcher was doing. Thatcher was breaking down the unions because the coal mines in Britain were inefficient, right? And it was cheaper to import it from Australia or China or wherever.
Yeah, okay.
Right? And that favoured capital. Right, i.e. the business owners.
Oh, huge economic growth.
Absolutely,
after that period.
Absolutely, and so that's now what you've seen lately, the last 12, 18 months, the unions are starting to expand again. Right, the United Auto Workers in the United States, they're starting to play up again. Right, and it's not about a judgment. It's simply saying the power is shifting, and this is one of the things we're going to talk about with children. Right, the power is shifting back to the employee because there's labour shortages.
Well, what I'm noticing is, on the conflict point, we're relying too much on import from countries such as Russia, China.
Absolutely.
And we're not getting along with them. So
Well,
they're pressing the stop button.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole point with the conflict, right? And COVID, what we did was we went, Jesus Christ, we're relying on the Chinese for all these masks. And if they go, well, no, we're not sending it to you, well, what are we going to do about it? We can't just go, oh, well, that's all right. We'll just knock up a factory and make them ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? And that's been a trigger. How many, just an example for demographics, how many siblings have you got?
Yeah, I've one sister.
Right.
Yeah, I got 2, 3 of us.
Yeah. See, I got 4. But I'm 60, you guys are 29 or 30.
Yeah.
So I'm old enough to be your father. But my point being, we had lots of, there were lots of people my
Rabbits
age.
back in the day.
Absolutely. There was, it was for a good cause, Jacob. But by the same token, the government's promoted that, right? Because we had child endowment policy. So the more children you had, the government would send you money. And they did that because we wiped out a few million in the war, right? World War II. So we had to sort of repopulate. And so that was what was going on. But we're now, just the three of us are a microcosm of the macro position, which is there's now going to be we can plot the chart and go, God, Jesus, there's going to be a lot of old people like Steve, and there's not going to be enough young people like Tom and Jacob, first of all, to look after Steve and all his old cronies, and secondly, these guys are not having enough kids to continue the population rise.
Because everything's too expensive to pop a baby out now.
But that, you see what I mean? Yeah. That's exactly right. Whereas in my day, my father, there was government subsidies, there was all this stuff. You know, the wages were quite good. Yeah, there was inflation, but the wages were good. Job security was like, you know, even for me, I left school at 15 and basically walked into a job. You know, whereas the guys now, and even you guys 15 years ago, it wasn't like, oh, well, I'll just pop in and, you know, get a job somewhere and build a career. It's a lot harder. And so, as you say, you look at it and go, oh, Jesus, how can I have a couple of kids if I haven't got a steady wage? I don't know what's going on in, you know, the economy. I can get sacked at the blink of an eye.
Everything's going up. Yeah.
100%.
Well, I look around. Interesting point. Obviously, I've got 2 kids. Jacob, obviously, none yet that we know of. But
he will after the show.
If I look around, it's more and more common. Most people are having like 1 or 2.
Exactly.
It's pretty rare to see, you know, people with 3 or 4. And I don't know anyone with 5.
Yep. And that's what I...
Probably a bit smarter now, actually.
Well, you are.
Yeah.
Well, but you see what I mean? Like, these things reach tipping points, and that's why, you know, we're sort of saying COVID, conflict, climate and children are all of these really big issues that change the way that investors need to think about the world going forward, right? So if I can use the broadest sort of argument, it's like saying, yeah, just buy technology, right? Because it boom and it's a growth area and blah, blah, blah. No, not anymore. You're going to make more money in oil and basic materials and commodities over the next probably 10 or 15 years rather than buying, you know, Zoom software or, you know, a package, right? Because, and the reason why is simple, because the world's changing, right? We're no longer, as Jacob said, we're not friends with Russia and China anymore. And so from that point of view, you look at it globally and it really changes things. I mean, I, you know, related the story to you guys, I think, about my investments in Russia, right? You know, well, you think about the next 10 years. The last place you'd be thinking about putting money is Russia, right? Because it's hostile. Iran, to a certain extent, China, you know, elements of Africa, elements of Eastern Europe, right? Where these countries are now saying, well, there used to be this one big superpower called the United States, and it basically ran everything. Then China rose and the United States went, hang on, this is not the way we like it to be. And so now, like the old days in the Cold War, there's now a bipolar world where there's America on sort of one side and China/Russia on the other side. And the countries are caught in the middle going, well, which way do I go? I mean, you think about Australia's position, right? Economically, the last 20 years, we've been, I shouldn't say completely, but we've been heavily reliant on China, right? Now, strategically, we've been totally committed to the US alliance, right? Well,
pick a team.
That's exactly right.
Or pick your own and go, you guys figure it out. We're going to start doing things here.
Yeah, but you get the problem with that is that a lot of these smaller countries, particularly in Asia and stuff, are basically saying, well, we just collateral damage, right, between the US and China because we're too small, right? You think we've got 27 million people. You know, there's not that many of us. And the only thing we've got, I shouldn't say the only thing, but the strong point we've got globally is we've got commodities, right? And if we're going to have these relationships where we no longer buy oil from the Russians, well, that might mean that countries will say, all right, well, listen, what we'll do is we'll convert to gas and we'll buy LNG from Australia, right? But other countries will say, well, we don't like Australia anymore, so we're not buying from Australia. We're going to buy from, you know, our allies. So think of Russia and all of those Russian states. right? They didn't really trade with the outside world, and that's what we're saying with deglobalization, right? Because for the last 40 years, we've all been having a fat time selling stuff to each other and essentially all getting rich.
Yeah, you do that, you do it, you can do it cheaper, all right, than we can do it. So, interesting. Because obviously we rely pretty heavily on, well, we have in the past relied pretty heavily on Russia for a lot of agricultural stuff too, right? Like wheat and that kind of thing. How do you think that's going to impact us?
Well,
if we relate it back to investing.
Yeah. Well, the agriculture, what we were saying before about the Middle East and Russia, Russia's full of grain and the food bowl, and Ukraine, and in the Middle East you've got oil.
Yeah,
and those two areas, prices will, if the Saudis say, well, we're going to reduce oil, right? The oil price rises, right? From one country going, we're going to stop producing so much oil. So that becomes a geopolitical tool for the Saudis to bargain with against the United States, right? So that's where you get inflation because, as you guys know, petrol's what, $2.10, $2.20?
Yeah.
I mean, I know 3 years ago it was about $1.40, right? And I never cared about petrol prices because who cares, But now I'm looking at it going, Jesus, it's $2.15. This is outrageous, right? Because I'm not used to it, right? So whereas 40 years ago it was like, this week petrol's $3. Oh, right, okay, well that's what you got to do, right? Because we were used to inflation. So for investors, you have to look at things like oil and say, okay, there might be a blow up in the oil market, but then you're going to have to say, like we're saying, hang on, you've got climate change, so then we're going to have to talk about wind power and solar power. Then you're going to have to toggle down and say, okay, well, these oil companies at the moment are providing really good dividends, but they can't get access to capital because the banks are saying, well, if you guys are not going to move to net zero emissions, we're not going to give you money to build new oil wells, right, to explore for new oil wells. We're going to go and favour the guys who want to build solar stations or wind stations, right? There's all of that sort of thing, which, as I say, we haven't had that for the last 40 years. It's just been drill, baby, drill, right? Yeah. And that, America's now a net exporter of energy. Well, that hasn't been the way for the last 40 years. And that changes all the global dynamics.
Interesting. Well, how's it going to affect the everyday Joe blogs though?
Well, the prices will. I think we'll get more. I say market volatility, but what I mean is exactly what's going on now, right? Look at your coffee. It was all cheaper 12 months ago, 18 months ago, right? It was $4. Now the small ones are $4.50. Well, that's 12.5% increase. So what I'm saying is that you look at the 10 years before it, there's no increases like that, right? The big hits, I think, are going to be in things like smartphones, right?
People buying less expensive things.
Well, because, Jacob, we had China sitting there, we probably mentioned this before in saying we need another 1 million smartphones. No worries, here they are, we'll knock them out in a week, right? Because you've got a huge surplus labour there in China that can just pump out stuff like you wouldn't believe, right? And so the last 40 years has been not a shortage of resources, but an abundance of resources, right? And so that's why the prices haven't gone anywhere and we've had huge deflation, right? Because we've been able to say if there's been excess demand, it's been met by this huge excess supply, right? Whereas now, and that's why I'm saying we're going from an era of abundance. There's plenty of labour, there's plenty of capital, there's plenty of resources, to a position now where I'm saying, no, we're running out of materials. Labour is becoming reduced because of demographics and wages are rising. So again, we're going to exactly the opposite sphere.
Yeah. I've got one for you, and I could be barking up the wrong tree, but isn't it just a normal part of the cycle where things start to get more expensive? The economy, we've had a good 20 years, the economy's booming, and now we're bottlenecking and slowing production down. Nobody can afford things anymore. Increase inflation. We're all hermit crabs a little bit for the next 5 years, going to a bear market, and then happy days we go again for 15 years. What's different now than the last time we had a bull into a bear market?
That's what history would suggest if I'm looking at it through, the lens. If I'm,
Yep.
Intuitively, I'm going to go, right, the last 20, 30 years, probably a good place to start. Good reference point for me.
Yeah.
Right?
Because that's your experience, Tom, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So completely agree with Jacob's point, and you hear all this stuff like, you see interest rates are rising. That's going to cause all this pressure. We're seeing, increased cost of living, which everyone is feeling it. But general sentiment is, give it a few years, this is going to cool off. Olympics is coming. Property will start to boom again. But what do you think to that?
Well, that's, again, I think where being older and having been through not just the sort of standard business cycle, 7-10 years, I've been through what I think and what I'm arguing is a paradigm shift. So in other words, at 60, I was 20 in 1980, right? And even before that, I remember, housing loans were 13.5%, right? And it wasn't like, I'm going to go and bargain for 11. No, dude, it's 13.5%. That's it. Banks closed at 3 o'clock. No, they didn't stay open. No, there was no online stuff. If you didn't get to the bank by 3, well, that's your problem, right? All of that's changed. So, but what you're saying, Tom, is correct, which is your experience has been in the last paradigm. And what I'm saying is, that's relevant, but that's no longer relevant because the paradigm has shifted. And to your argument Jacob, your argument about, can't we just have a depression and go back to the old ways? And that's why I'm saying no, because the 4 Cs have had such a fundamental, having such a fundamental impact globally that everybody is changing. And so if you think through each of those issues, right, including globalisation, you got conflict, right, worldwide. So what's happened there? In the last 2 years, military expenditure has gone through the roof, right? So what does that mean? Well, that means governments are saying, we've got to secure the resources to build bombs, right? Okay, what are the resources? Well, we need lots of critical minerals and we need semiconductor chips. Okay, so semiconductor chips, America said to the Chinese, no, you're not getting access to the top stuff now, okay? That really, if you look at it, that's like an act of war, right? If you look at climate, it is useless for Australia to say we're going to meet our net zero and everyone else is out there partying like crazy and polluting the joint, right? We're all breathing the same air. So from that point of view, that's got to be a global solution, right? COVID is continuing to spread and become actually more virulent in some of the strains. And how is that happening? From global travel, right? From people getting on planes and switching countries. Now, that is a global issue. It doesn't matter if Australia says, we're going to look after the Sydney to Melbourne league. It's like, no, dude, you've got to look after the Singapore to Brisbane league. Yeah. That's where the global people are coming from.
The problem is no one's talking about it anymore either. It's all,
absolutely.
You get COVID, you go home, you just go to sleep for a couple of days and go back out and get on with your day.
That caused enough stress.
Well, you see, what's happened now is we're now getting more and more evidence to show the damage of COVID with long COVID. And another issue just more recently, which gives you a perfect idea, people are having uncontrollable diarrhea on planes. And they're holding the flight because they're, pardon the French, they're shitting themselves, right? And they've had to unload the flights, right? And you know what it's from? It's a result of COVID, right?
Right.
Okay. And so what I'm saying is this is what we're getting more and more stuff on COVID by going, they now realise if you've had COVID, you're getting an increase in
The shits.
well, that, yeah, but also heart problems, right? The old idea was, it's all right if kids get it, they'll be fine. No, that's not the idea anymore, right? And so there's all of these problems. Last week there was a judgment where the judge said that Carnival Cruises was responsible for the spreading of COVID on some of its cruise ships. Bang, liability. Right? So now a company says, well, hang on, we're going to be up for $5 million every year because people are going to sue us for COVID. Okay, well, we're going to have to put the prices up, or we're going to have to spend $10 million per ship to, do something about it. So you then move to the other seas, and that's what I mean. Because there's so much interaction, you can't disassemble that without having an enormous change in the underlying structure. Right? That's what I'm saying. These are fundamental changes that the whole world is going through, and you can't solve them by simply saying, we'll cut interest rates. Right? That's not the point.
Like a Band-Aid solution.
Yeah, but it's not even a Band-Aid, Jacob. It's basically saying the Band-Aid, it's no use using a Band-Aid because you really need...
On a gunshot wound.
Yeah, a whole new bandage, and we're going to have to cut your leg off and give you a new one, right? Yeah. It's that big. And the argument is, for the last 40 years, the market will solve it, right? It'll be sorted out through the price mechanism. Whereas now, what I'm saying is, if there is a shortage of resources, both physical and material, then what you have to say is, okay, we need to maximise the efficiency of those resource uses to ensure everybody gets something. Whereas for the past 30 or 40 years, as you guys probably know, you have to rely on your own smarts. Right, the government's not there to help individuals much, and they haven't for the past 30 or 40 years. And so what that means is, well, you're on your own, i.e. the market will resolve it. You can't get a job? Well, go and skill up, right? But I haven't got any money. Well, bad luck. Go and work 3 jobs to get yourself through university. Whereas before it was the government would, as I said, in my era, I can't even remember, but, it was just like, yeah, go to this bloke. And I went to that bloke, how are you? Good, yeah, start Monday. It's like, okay. And that was it. Whereas, you don't get that these days.
So bringing it back to globalisation, deglobalisation, I mean, economic theories have all got a lifespan. So that's all changing. What should we expect? What are we going to move to? How can somebody swim through or navigate this next paradigm?
Well, we'll talk about those in future shows. I've listed 10 things there, I think, that are big changes out of the 4 Cs. And so that's where I'm trying to guide investors into saying, the way that you've invested for the last 30 or 40 years in a low inflation, low interest rate, globalised world is over. Now, you're not going to wake up Monday and go, oh my God, Steve's right, look at it, the world's completely changed. But what I'm saying is we are trending back to what I'd say, the new normal is the old normal, right? So what I'm saying is, those days of saying, I can negatively gear a property because interest rates are at 2% and inflation's at 2%, so it'll be a really good investment because there's going to be a big capital gain. What I'm saying is, no, that's a completely different picture now, buddy, because interest rates are at 6%, and we're already seeing that, right? Interest rates at 6, inflation at 5. The argument 12 months to 2 years ago was, that's all right, interest rates will fall again. Well, now the Federal Reserve is saying, no, higher for longer, right? So that's why I'm saying that's a completely different world where you look at property and say, for example, well, I'm negatively geared property, I'm going to lose money on the rent, but that's okay because I bought it for $1 million and I'm going to sell it for $1.5 million, right? That's no longer the case because you're now saying, well, hang on, I bought it for $1 million. Instead of losing $200 a week, I'm now losing $600 a week. So I've got to make at least $600 a week plus expenses plus capital gain. Okay, that sucker's got to go up $50,000 a year for me to make money. That influences your investment allocation decision by saying, well, hang on, that's no longer a great investment. And I think, we were talking before the show, you can get 5% in cash.
Yeah.
Right? Old people like me go, fair, great, I've got a fair bit of money, 5%, that'll cover my cost of living. Why would I take a risk of owning stocks at 60 when I don't really need to? Right? That's what goes on. Institutional investments with a 60-40 bond split or whatever allocation say, well, if I can get 5% safely, why am I risking it for an extra, 1 or 2% in stocks over 10 or 15 years, and inflation's going to eat away all that capital gain?
Yeah. I mean, look, just to kind of like tie this all back, right? The last 30, 40 years, for the most part, and there's been exceptions. We've obviously had enormous crashes, but everything's trended pretty hard. But really, you could get away with buying most things and making money, like fundamentally. Like even if you go back, if you've been a savvy investor through this period, you do extremely well.
Yes.
Like there's still obviously been a lot of opportunities to pick things up that are undervalued, flip them when they're overvalued. But what you're saying is that's going to be more important now than ever. Because
buy and hold has been a great strategy for the most part.
Yeah. Now it's just got to be a bit more strategic with it. Commodities probably where it's going to be worth looking at, where they haven't done a lot. Absolutely.
That's why I say that the world's changing. The next 10 years, or, let's fast forward to 2033, I think we're going to be looking back going, wow, right? Because globalization's declining. As I said, you've got climate change, COVID, conflict, and children, 4 major drivers of economics in the future, right? Rising interest rates, rising inflation, rising wages costs, rising volatility, rising military intervention, right? All of that sort of stuff. We're not going to be doing the same stuff.
Let's start to wrap this up now, gents. I think next week we'll talk about some more really pressing topics that I think will help the listeners a lot. And we'll see you then. Cheers.
Okay.
Awesome.
Cheers, folks.
Thank you.
That's it for another episode of Stock Market Mentor. We hope you have enjoyed the show, and if you have any questions about the episode or want to discuss how we can help you become a better investor, please feel free to contact us at support@stockmarketmentor.com.au. We'll see you next time.